chapter of Matthew, Jesus lays out a process of how we are to treat someone and what we are to do if someone in the church has sinned against us or is creating problems for us as an individual or for the church as a whole. And he said the first thing to do is go to that person and confront them one-on-one. If they change their ways and see the errors of their way, then wonderful, you have reconciled that person back into the fold. If they don't, take two people with you so that you have 2 or 3 witnesses. If the person still doesn't change their ways, acknowledge their sin, then it goes to the whole church. And if at the end of this process they have not seen the error of their ways and changed their ways, then we are to remove them from the rolls and ask them to no longer come to church until such a time as they can behave or rectify the situation that they've created. Now that seems a little harsh. And as a pastor, I've had to enact this process several times to different degrees. And the thing I've heard over and over again every time we've had to do it is, oh, Pastor, that's not nice. Oh, that's just not nice. You know, it's not nice. Well, you know what? Jesus never told us to be nice. He didn't. He didn't say, go therefore and be nice. He said, go therefore and love your neighbor as yourself. And loving someone means that there are times when we have to use tough love. And the goal of this process that he lays out is not to get rid of someone or to kick them out. The goal is to bring them back into the fold where they can be a full member. Because once someone starts acting up, acting out, they isolate themselves from the rest of the community. The rest of the community doesn't want anything to do with them because of the damage they're creating, the tension that they're creating. And so they have built a wall by their actions between them and the congregation or them and the people around them. And so the goal of this situation is to remove that wall and bring them back into the fold. And before I move on to how this applies to us as a family, I'm going to give you an example of a church situation. I'm going to tell you about Ethel. Ethel was in charge of funeral dinners. And Ethel had always been in charge of funeral dinners. And Ethel took her job very seriously. And the first time we had a death after I became pastor at that church, I asked our secretary, I'm like, you know what, I don't even know how we start funeral. What do we do for funeral dinners? And she said, oh, you got to call Ethel, and good luck. Well, oh my gosh. Not only that funeral, but the next 1 or 2 funerals after that, I started realizing we had a big problem. It was Ethel. Ethel was like Attila the Hun. And every time someone died and I announced that we were going to have a funeral and a funeral dinner, you could just hear the whole congregation go, uh-oh, and groan, because they knew what it meant. Ethel would call you, and Ethel wouldn't ask you if you'd like to donate something or if you'd like to cook something. She would just tell you you're going to. And to make matters worse, she would tell you what you were going to bring. So you might get a phone call from Ethel, and she would be telling you, I need 6 cans of corn in a dish. Or you might be in charge of potatoes that week. And if you were a single man, a widower or a single man for any reason, you didn't have to cook, but Ethel hit you up for money to help buy the chicken. So she would get on the phone and call our little old men and tell them how much money they were going to donate, and that they could give it to her at church the following Sunday. And sure enough, Ethel would be standing by me at the front door. As I greeted people coming in, Ethel would be standing with her clipboard, looking for the little old men to totter in, and they better have their cash in their hands, because they were not getting past Ethel, and they were not going to their pew until they ponied up the money that they owed Ethel for the chicken. And one of the complaints that I kept hearing was that Ethel called everybody in the congregation. I mean, and this was a fairly large congregation. So what that meant was the first time I went downstairs after I had done a funeral and we had left the cemetery and I beat the family back to the church and I go downstairs, it took my breath away. It was ridiculous. The amount of food that was laid out for this funeral dinner, I kid you not, I've been to buffets in Las Vegas that had less food. There was a table of hors d'oeuvres, there was a table of desserts. I mean, we're talking 8-foot tables full of dessert. There was like 5 or 7 salads, 6 or 7 different kinds of vegetables. I can't even tell you. And I'm thinking, what are we going to do with all this food? This is overboard. Not every single person in the congregation has to donate for every single funeral. This is ridiculous. And people would talk to me and they would tell me, you know, Ethel's making this horrible. And I'm like, well, we need to get Ethel out of this position. And they're like, oh, no, we can't do that. Why not? Well, it's not nice. Like, what Ethel's doing is not nice. So I let it slide for a while because as a new pastor, you don't have much clout until you've been there a while to build up some clout. And I wasn't sure I had enough clout to take Ethel on head to head. Until the day I called Ethel to tell her that a man who had grown up in the church, and this is one of those families where he had grown up there and his father before him had grown up there and his father before him had grown up there, you know, they'd been members of this congregation forever. And he'd been a council president, he'd been choir director. I mean, he was so active up until the point that he retired. And then he and his wife moved to Florida. He had died, and of course his family wanted to bring him back to Ohio and bury him in Ohio, and wanted him buried out of his home congregation. I'm like, well, absolutely. So, you know, I talked to the family, we got all the details worked out, and I called Ethel to say, all right, we need a funeral lunch. And she said, oh, no, we won't be doing a funeral lunch for this man. Excuse me? What are you talking about? What do you mean? And she said, well, he doesn't deserve a funeral lunch. Let me tell you. I was like, really? What do you have to do to deserve a funeral lunch? I thought, silly me, I thought you just had to die. But obviously there's more. She said he hasn't been to church in 20 years. I said, Ethel, he moved to Florida 20 years ago. She said, well, I know. But he hasn't been in church. He doesn't deserve a funeral service, let alone a funeral lunch. Well, by now, my daddy was starting to kick up inside of me. And I was losing my patience. And I really lost it when she said, look, Pastor, don't get snippy with me. I'm just telling you how we do things around here. I said, no, Ethel, thank you for telling me how you used to do things around here. Now let me tell you how we're going to start doing things differently around here. We went through the process that Jesus lays out of sitting Ethel down and talking to her. And one-on-one I had a conversation. It didn't do any good. And I took a couple of members with me and we had a conversation and it didn't do any good. I mean, we had constructive ideas for ways that we could change the way the funeral lunches are done to make it better for everybody involved. Ethel wanted nothing to do with it. So we ended up having to remove Ethel as the chair of the funeral lunches. That was 12 years ago. Ethel still hates my guts to this day. But I got to tell you, the change that happened after that was phenomenal because funeral lunches became what they should be. It's a ministry to a grieving family. And the people who were working in the kitchen helping used to be scared to death. And there would be no laughing, no talking, because everybody knew you had to do what Ethel wanted you to do the way Ethel wanted it, and everybody was on edge. But afterwards, everybody was just so friendly and loving and embraced these families, and it was a safe place for these families after they buried their loved one. And it just went through 4 days of hell to gather, to laugh and tell stories and to enjoy a meal and be surrounded by happy people from church who were loving them. But I got to tell you, it was tough. It was hard. And a lot of people said, oh, that's not nice. That's not nice. Well, We're not called to be nice. We're called to be loving. And sometimes that means tough love. We can all think of family members who, because of addiction to drugs or alcohol or mental problems or any one of a number of things, create chaos in families. And we are called to love them and to try to work with them to restore them to the family. But we are not called to be doormats. Jesus does not want us to be abused. So after we've done everything we can to help them and to restore them to the loving place in our family, if it doesn't work, then sometimes we have to make the decision to let them suffer the consequences of their own actions. And that is the pure definition of tough love, because that hurts. It hurts us, it hurts them. But I want you to know that when you find yourself in those situations, or if you're feeling guilty about having had a situation like that, let it go. If your attempts to restore them to their loving place and to help them cease the behavior that is harming themselves and others doesn't work, then we have to let them go, with the prayer that God will take care of them, and that maybe someday they will realize and get the help they need and be welcomed back into the fold. It's not about being nice. It's about being loving. And sometimes that means loving ourselves enough to protect ourselves from the bad influence and abuse of someone else.